The others were fairly similar.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to our second lecture on Columba. Last week we didn't actually reach Columba himself. We talked about some aspects of the growth of faith in Scotland before Columba and before the Irish Celtic missionaries came over from Ireland. But I assure you that today we will actually reach Columba, and Columba will reach Scotland, although just and no more. We trust everybody's signed in, and also that you've picked up one of the little summary sheets for today. On the second page of the summary sheet there is a bibliography of various writings that may be of interest, not all of which are available currently in print, but nearly all of which are available on Amazon or Alibris, or even in the library here in Highland Theological College. The most important text for us, of course, is the life of Columba by St. Adomnan of Iona, and we'll be talking about that in more detail on another occasion. And also available at various points for your interest in Bede, the ecclesiastical history of the English people, which is an invaluable resource, again written just after the time that Adomnan wrote his book on St. Columba. And then also of great interest, although we'll probably not get to this until next week, is this book by Thomas Clancy and Gilbert Marcus, Iona, the earliest poetry of a Celtic monastery. And Clancy and Marcus are very high-level scholars, and they've identified what they believe is authentic poetry coming from Iona, from the very earliest Celtic Columban traditions. Over the centuries, various things, it's been said of them, well, that was written by Columba, or that was written by Columba, and we're not sure. But what Clancy and Marcus have in this volume, certainly from the viewpoint of scholars, fulfills all the criteria of very early writings. More general book on early Scottish history is James Earl Fraser's book, From Caledonia to Pictland, Scotland to 795, volume 1 of the New Edinburgh History of Scotland. It is available in Waterstones, but when you go to it you find there's no price attached to the book, and that's always a worrying sign. And when you ask at the desk, your worries are confirmed. It's quite expensive, and Sheila, don't tell Grace that I said it was such an expensive book, my wife. But it's very good, very informative. He has his own theories, and we'll come across these as we go through the lectures. Occasionally gets bogged down in detail, but that's almost impossible to avoid. Much more readable is a book from 100 years ago, William Skene, the doyen of 19th century Scottish history, and volume 2 in his series on Celtic Scotland, called Church and Culture. Now, what Skene writes, some of his conclusions nowadays are not agreed to by modern scholars, and so you always have to bear that in mind. But what he does write is written so well, and is very, very readable, and is very, very well explained. So that's just one or two of the books that may be of interest. Now, in our first lecture, we looked at the arrival of Christian faith in Scotland before the time of Columba and before the time of the missionary saints from Ireland. And what we arrived at was a patchwork of Christian influences and Christian presences in southern Scotland and in regions of the Central Belt, the Forth Clyde Valley, as it were. In particular, we notice that the British kingdom of Strathclyde, whose capital was Dumbarton Rock, Auld Clut, could be regarded as a Christian kingdom even before the Irish missionaries such as Columba arrived. And in today's lecture, we'll look at three things. First, we'll look at Columba's early years in Ireland. Second, we'll look at his arrival in Scotland. And third, if we have time, though I fear we won't, we'll have to put this over to next week, we'll begin to evaluate our sources for Columba, the historical documents that we rely on. And we'll also discuss some of the recent literature. However, now that we're looking at Columba directly, we have to indicate, as we did a few minutes ago, our main source, Adomnan's Life of Columba, written 100 years after Columba's death, and Adomnan was the 9th abbot of Iona. He used earlier material, and he says that himself in his introduction. And so next week we'll look at this source in detail and we'll discuss what kind of book it is and how we should read it. But moving on now to our first heading, Dalriata and the Irish Christian Church, the Irish Celtic Church. It was from Ireland that the Celtic missionaries came to Western Scotland and the Hebrides. And we can see there, of course, how close the north of Ireland is to both Galilee and also the Mull of Kintyre, that arm of land coming down towards Ireland at the top of the picture. By the middle of the 6th century, the 550s, Ireland was predominantly Christian. Not every tribe had been converted from Druidism, but most had, and the process would soon be completed. And in the 6th century, Ireland was a land of many tribes. They were called tuaths, and each tribe or tuath had its own king or rí. There was also a high king, an ard rí, recognized by the tribes. However, each tuath was functionally independent, and the high king or the ard rí did not have final authority. But his status was recognized, honoured, and mostly respected. In the north of Ireland, the dominant tuaths were the Uí and there were two branches, the northern Uí to which Columba belonged, and the southern Uí, which at that point was also the tribe of the High King of Ireland, the Ard Rí. Part of Uí territory was the kingdom of Dalriata, coloured pink. But the Irish kingdom of Dalriata had also established a colony in Scotland, in present-day Argyll. And so in Argyll, in Scotland, there was a sister kingdom of Scottish Dalriata with its own king, but a very close connection between the two. And so a bridge had been made between the north of Ireland and part of western Scotland. The inhabitants of Irish Dalriata had been given the name Scoti, which means pirates, and so they were known as Scots, and that name eventually was taken to Argyll, and then eventually was the name for Scotland. But the Dalriata settlement in Argyll did not only transfer the word Scoti to our shores, it transferred much more. And in particular, Dalriata took Christian faith to its Argyll colony. And so before Columba sailed from Ireland, the kingdom of Dalriata in Scotland was, by and large, a nation whose primary religion could be regarded as Christianity. But also the Christianity that came to Western Scotland through Dalriata and through Columba was a Christianity moulded by the Irish Celtic Church. So in a sense, we've almost set the scene. as we approach the time of Columba, what do we have in Scotland? We have a Christian presence throughout the south of Scotland, which perhaps even extended north of the Forth Clyde line. We have the kingdom of Strathclyde, seeing itself as a Christian kingdom. And we have the colony of Dalriata in Argyll, also professing Christianity. And we also have a wave of eager Irish Celtic missionary monks ready to take the gospel literally anywhere. And so, around the year 563, a middle-aged man in his early 40s, of distinctive aristocratic bearing but attired as a monk, alighted from a curragh onto the shores of Scotland. A curragh or a coracle. Now, a curragh was a small boat whose hull was made of leather, and there could be one or two men curraghs. There could also be much larger curraghs, still called a curragh. In 1976 and 1977, the explorer Tim Severin constructed a large curragh from directions given in ancient Irish documents, the voyages of Brendan the Navigator. Tim Severin's wife was a PhD student in medieval literature. She was studying the ancient Irish texts in the British Library, the original texts. And she said to her husband Tim, she said, when I read these texts about the voyage of St. Brendan, they have a different structure, a different appearance than other medieval texts. They seem to go back much further. This led on to interest, and Tim Severin began to look at the directions for making the type of ship that St. Brendan said he had made. And he made it, and it's a brilliant story in the book that he wrote about it. And over 2 summers, he and a crew of 5 or 6 were able to sail from Ireland to Scotland, then to the Faroes, then to Iceland, and across the Atlantic to America, on the route that Brendan claimed to have travelled in his Travels of Brendan the Navigator as an early Christian monk. Now, Tim Severin, it would probably be in the large 2-masted curragh that this man, in 563, came to Scotland. And he and 12 companions had come from Ireland. At the first glance, they may have seemed to be just another group of zealous Irish Celtic brothers on a mission to Dalriata in Scotland. But this man was, to borrow a phrase, the special one. He was Columba, Columcille, Creamthon, the dove of the church, and he left his homeland in ambiguous circumstances. Now, what did Columba look like? Probably not as in the picture. Our evidence is sparse, but there is at least one clue in a poem written soon after Columba's death, within a year of his death, 598. The poem is the Amra Columcille, and it speaks of his soft grey eye. Like other Celtic monks, Columba would have been lean and sparse. He would be weather-beaten, but he'd also have the bearing of an aristocrat, because he was of royal blood. The novelist Nigel Tranter constructs an image from clues scattered throughout various sources. Tranter describes Columba as a tall, handsome, fair-haired, well-built and notable horseman, fond of sports, possessing a fine singing voice. He could sing on Iona and it would be heard across the water in the Ross of Mull. He also had a hot temper. And the hot temper is significant. The name Columba, as we know, means dove. Columcille means dove of the church. And we associate the dove with peace. But Columba could be a hawk as well as a dove. And all through his life there was a tension between the humble servant of God who washed the feet of his monks and the power broker, the mover and fixer, the canny politician. And later in the series, we'll look at some of these aspects. Now, in fact, Columba spent more of his life in Ireland than in Scotland. He was born in Ireland. He was educated in Ireland. He made a name and a reputation for himself in Ireland before he left in 563. Why did he leave? No one really knows. And in the absence of a clear-cut record, speculations have multiplied. And we'll come back to this. At this point, we look back on Columba's earlier life. Where did this powerful and controversial figure come from? The traditional dates are that he was born on the 7th of December 521 at Garcan in Ireland to a high-ranking Irish political family. His father was Fedlimid, his mother was Ithne. The family was descended on his father's side from Neil of the Nine Hostages. In the late 4th century, Neil had built up the power of his clan, the Uí Neil, until it dominated north from Tara northwards. Within the Irish kingship system, Columba had the possibility himself of becoming king of the Uí Neil. He was a prince of royal blood. One of the lives of Columba, the old Irish life of Columba, which is not an early one, in fact, it's more a medieval life. It claims that Columba was eligible to the kingship of Erin of Ireland according to family, and that kingship was offered to him if he himself had not abandoned it for God and for gospel service. Skene, in his little note to that, says that even in the old Irish life, it probably means that it was possible to be offered to him, rather than the kingship having actually been offered to Columba. But the old Irish life isn't so old, and so it's a little bit of an extravagant source to rely on. But certainly he was an aristocrat, he was from royal blood, and all through his life he had that self-confidence that comes from that background. And all his life, Columba had an ease of relationships with chiefs and kings and power players. The culture of rank was his comfort zone and his natural milieu. And in the years to come, Columba put his contacts and his diplomatic activities at the service of his calling. At a young age, Columba's parents handed over their son into the care of churchmen. Now, this was not an uncommon practice. Before Christianity came to Ireland, and Columba's parents were probably only of a Christian family of, say, maybe a couple of generations. But before Christianity came to Ireland, it was normal for parents to give their sons to a high druid or an Ollin Fili, a chief poet, as a guardian for spiritual training. Columba's parents were Christians, but Christian faith was only a few generations old in Ireland, and so the old custom of handing over a child to a guardian holy man for education was now transferred to Christian holy men. And so while a youth, Columba stayed with Finian or Finbar of Malville studying the Holy Scriptures, one of two Finians who come into Columba's story. Now, this Finian was probably the Finian of Malville, as indicated, whom Columba clashed with in later years. And then, still a deacon, Columba left Malville and was tutored by Gemmin in Leinster, who is called a Christ bard in the old Irish life. And Columba never forgot the importance of bardic power, and it may have been with the aged Gemnin that Columba developed his powers of rhetoric. And certainly the idea that Columba was interested in bardic, poetic representation of the faith is very powerful in the old traditions. And there was an old tradition that at a later political summit meeting, that Columba argued for the rights of the ancient bards to be maintained in Ireland when they were being sidelined. Columba's final training was at Clonard in County Meath, and here Finian of Clonard had established a great monastic school around 520. By Columba's time, the monastic school at Clonard had over 3,000 students. Each student had his own cell of wood or wattle construction daubed with clay. It was at Clonard that Columba completed his training and was ordained a priest. Columba was part of what you might call a golden generation of students at Clonard. And he was one of 12 particularly outstanding Clonard students. And they were called the 12 Apostles of Ireland. And to them, according to tradition, was given the task of completing the conversion of their country. At that point, most of Ireland had been Christianized, but not all. But to Columba's generation fell the task of completing that work. Columba then started his work in Ireland after graduating from Clonard, as it were. And this consisted of preaching, of founding monasteries in unconverted territories, establishing communities of evangelistically minded monks who brought that tribe under Christian influence. The first of many foundations ascribed to Columba was in 546 in Derry. Then after founding Derry, Columba spent 15 or 16 years establishing churches and monasteries all over the north of Ireland in Uí territory. Some sources in the ancient poems say he was responsible for founding 300 churches. Others point to 100 in coastal areas alone. Now the question arises, what constitutes a founding of a church or founding of a monastery? It may have been as much as establishing a complete monastic community such as at Derry. Or it may have been as little as being involved in a service of dedication for a small oratory or prayer house. You know, for example, to put it into modern terms, if we were in churches in a city or a large town and we decided to rent an office space or a vacant shop space in a housing area, and we went along and with a prayer of dedication, that would be regarded as founding a church. And when you put it in these terms, you can see how Columba could found 100 churches or 300 churches, establishing a presence, dedicating that presence to the gospel, leaving somebody there who is able to carry on the work. And that place continuing to see itself as having a connection with this man who was responsible for its founding. So it doesn't involve him building 300 buildings as great as the medieval abbey. It's establishing a community, a presence in a new area. And so Columba's career in Ireland was one of unbroken success. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. And when eventually he came to Scotland in 563, he came as a man used to success. He came as a man who expected things to happen. And that's important to grasp. He came as a man who expected things to happen. He expected projects to deliver. But why in his early 40s did this successful monk leave Ireland? How do we solve a problem like Columba? The most common theory is that Columba left Ireland because of a dispute over a plagiarized psalter. The claim is that around 568, Columba borrowed a book of Psalms that belonged to Finian of Malville, and without Finian's permission, he made a copy and he kept it for himself. Now when Finian found this out, he demanded his psalter back. The tradition is he had been on pilgrimage to Rome, he had brought it from Rome. He was quite happy for Columba to read it. He wasn't so happy about Columba having copied it. So he demanded his psalter back, and he also demanded to have the copy that Columba allegedly had copied illegally. Columba, the dove, refused to hand it over. Finian then appealed to Dermot, High King of Ireland and chief of the southern Uí Remember, Columba belongs to the northern Uí And the individual tribes in Ireland were a bit like nations within the European community. And if you say that, if you like, that the High King, the Ard Rí, was like the president of the European community, and the other Rís or kings were like the individual prime minister. And so there wasn't always total agreement between the two. So Finian appealed to Dermot, High King of Ireland, chief of the southern Uí and King Dermot upheld Finian's claim for copyright control. And he said that Finian should have back not only his original psalter, but he should have back the copy. He declared, to every cow its calf, to every book its copy. Columba was not happy with this decision of Dermot, High King of Ireland. And there was history between Columba and Dermot. Sometime previously, a man who was fleeing from Dermot's anger had been given sanctuary by Columba, but the High King violated the law of sanctuary. He dragged the victim away and he executed him, and Columba remembered that. Additionally, Columba was from the northern Uí whereas Dermot was from the southern branch of the Uí And moreover, Dermot, though officially Christian, was suspected of syncretism, of still supporting the ancient Druidical religions. So unsurprisingly, Columba refused to accept Dermot's verdict. Things went from bad to worse. Open warfare broke out between the two branches of the Uí Now, did Columba's kinsmen rise in his support? Was that the reason for the war? Or was the copyright issue simply an excuse to promote an already existing tension into physical conflict? Or did King Dermot embark on a military campaign to enforce his authority? We don't know. Whatever the outcome, whatever the reason, the outcome was disastrous. A brutal, bloody battle was fought at Colebdne. Dermot was defeated. Over 3,000 men were killed in the battle. Dermot himself survived the slaughter, but in the aftermath of the carnage, Columba was criticised on three main counts. First, Columba had not accepted Dermot's judgment. Dermot was the Ard Rí. His verdict should have been respected. Second, it was claimed that Columba had instigated the battle. It was his awkwardness that had inflamed a very delicate situation between the southern Uí and the northern Uí. And third, it was claimed and recorded later in the Annals of Ulster that during the battle that Columba stood, hands raised, and he prayed not for peace, but for victory, in an openly public and partisan manner. He stood with hands raised to heaven, praying for victory for the northern Uí over the southern Uí. Whatever the truth, in 561, a year after the Battle of Colebdne, Columba was excommunicated by a synod of Irish clergy meeting at Teltown. The excommunication came despite Columba having a stellar reputation in Ireland as a founder of monasteries. Teltown itself was in the territory of the southern Uí and in fact Columba was tried in his absence. But soon after the edict of excommunication was delivered, Columba appeared on the scene. He arrived at the synod, he entered the company, and one of his great friends, Brendan, the navigator we mentioned earlier, rose up from his seat, came to meet him and embraced him, a very public statement. And with Columba present, his allies gained confidence. There were more discussions, and in the good tradition of all these summits, the edict of excommunication was quickly reversed. Everything now seemed fine, and yet within 2 years, 563, Columba had left Ireland for Scotland. And the question is, are the events linked? So is the plagiarized Psalter story true? The plagiarized Psalter story is attractive, but what facts do we know for certain? We know there was a battle of Codrebne. We know there was a synod at Teltown, and that the synod was deeply concerned about the bloodshed. We know that Columba was excommunicated for something, and then swiftly reinstated. Even Adomnan, Columba's main biographer, concedes that Columba had been disciplined for something, but Adomnan won't tell us what it was. And we know that within 2 years of the synod, Columba had left Ireland. But we do not know if Columba's leaving Ireland was a consequence of events surrounding the Battle of Codrebne. The romantic legend, of course, is that Columba left Ireland charged with a penance of winning as many new souls to Christ as men had been killed in the battle. And if so, was that a penance imposed on Columba by others, or was it a self-imposition? As we said, Adomnan sheds little light on the murky episode. Adomnan's goal in his life of Columba is to present Columba as a spiritual giant, and saintliness must not be tarnished by a great fall. And so Adomnan prefers to speak of a temporary excommunication imposed by an incompetent synod for a trivial offence. And he draws a veil over the unspecified fault. He doesn't talk much about the fault, but he gives huge coverage to the decision to reverse the excommunication. He writes that the same synod members now honoured Columba, quote, with great reverence, end quote. And this is Adomnan's way of deftly dismissing an awkward moment in Columba's career. But if Columba had been cleared by the synod, why did he leave Ireland? And here several theories have been put forward. To begin with, the Annals of Ulster are simply factual. They simply record that Columba set sail for the island of the island of Iona, in the 42nd year of his age. Adomnan, he gives a very positive spin. For Adomnan, Columba left Ireland simply with a burning spiritual mission and without a stain on his character. For Adomnan, Columba's desire is to be a peregrini, a wanderer for Christ. He sailed away from Ireland to Britain, wishing to be a pilgrim for Christ. And Adomnan only refers to the Battle of Codrebne in order to give a date for the departure from Ireland. He doesn't connect the events. This is also the reason given in the Old Irish Life of Columba, quoted by Steen, which says, when Columba had made the circuit of all Ireland, preaching to everybody in Ireland, when numerous multitudes had been baptized by him, what he had determined from the beginning of his life came into his mind to go on pilgrimage. He then meditated going across the sea to preach the word of God to the men of Alba, Scotland, and to the Britons and Saxons. He went therefore on a voyage. So the Old Irish Life also carries on this interpretation that Columba left Ireland simply to go on a spiritual mission to preach the gospel, and not a hint of anything having happened in Ireland. Mary Herbert Bede, in his history, it simply says that Columba left to evangelize the northern Picts. Mary Herbert, the very notable Irish scholar, her theory is that Columba left Ireland to break away from tribal associations. She suggests that Columba left Ireland because it was difficult for Columba to live a truly monastic life in a land where his family had such prominence and power. And she argues that unless he exiled himself, Columba could never be free from the political pressures that hindered his vocation. Against this theory, we note that Columba had already spent 40 years in his homeland without feeling constricted there. Ian Finlay, who wrote a very, very good life of Columba around about 1979, and Ian Finlay is former curator of the Royal National Museum of Scotland, and I think his life of Columba is certainly perhaps my favourite one. His theory is that Columba moved to Scottish Dalriata in order to shore up the church in the new colony. And Finlay argues that the 2-year gap between the Synod of Tailtown in 561 and leaving for Dalriata in 563 is too long a gap for Columba to have gone because he'd been told to go. If he left because of the Synod, Ian Finlay argues, he would have left much sooner. And Finlay's view is that Columba was both a prince and a monk, so Columba sailed to Argyll to add his considerable weight to the whole Dalriata venture in Argyll. Both the political side of it and also the church, the ecclesiastical side of it. The community in Dalriata in Scotland was an Irish Christian one, but it was under severe military threat from the Picts. And according to Ian Finlay's theory, Columba felt responsibility to his people who were in danger there. And when he set out, he was already aware that Christian Dalriata in Argyll could only be safe if he eventually took the gospel to the very Picts who threatened his compatriots. So that's how Ian Finlay arrives at his conclusion. There's also, in truth, we don't know why Columba left Ireland. Was it punishment, penance, peregrination, protecting a kingdom, expanding horizons? All of these are possible. But maybe the poem composed soon after Columba's death gives a clue. The Amra Colum Kiel, written by the blind poet Dallin Forgale, says Columba has been, sorry about lockdown here, Columba has been, quote, buried in Britain for fear of hell. He desires to avoid an eternal death. Why did the Amra Colum Kiel, an honour poem in praise of Columba, say he was buried in Britain for fear of hell? Was it because his penance stipulated he must not be laid to rest in an Irish grave? Was that because so many lay in Irish graves after the Battle of Culdrebany? We don't know, but to Scotland he came. The romantic story, of course, is that Columba landed on several Scottish islands. But he re-embarked each time because he could still see Ireland. He was determined to go somewhere where he could no longer see his homeland, so whenever he landed on an island, he went to the highest point, looked to the horizon, can I see Ireland? Yes, I still can. I'll move on to another one. Eventually, according to the romantic legend, he came ashore on Iona, at the now named Bay of the Coracle. He climbed a small hill, he checked that Ireland was no longer in view. He then destroyed the curragh that had brought him there, decided to make Iona his home. The spot now called the Cairn of the Back to Erin. In fact, if he had modern binoculars, he could have seen Ireland. He didn't. So that's a romantic story, but the sources give us something more complicated. To begin with, Columba returned to Ireland not just once but many times. Moreover, his journey to Iona was more convoluted than what romance expresses. Nevertheless, when Columba did leave Ireland, it was a real step away from all that had been his life up to that point. He left home, family, position, prestige. On the other hand, he wasn't travelling alone, he had his companions, nor was he journeying totally into the unknown. He was sailing to a land, Scottish Dalriata, which had had links with Ireland for generations. And some of its principal families were related to his own family. So Iona was not the first island that Columba stayed on. Before Columba and his colleagues arrived on Iona, according to Adomnan, he had already spent time on other islands of the Inner Hebrides off the west coast of Scotland. More importantly, he made an early contact with King Conall of Dalriata in Argyll. And Conall was not an unknown quantity. He was of Irish descent, he was Christian in his religion, he was linked by blood to Columba's own family, he was a cousin. And Conall at that time was in a tight spot. In 559, his predecessor and uncle Gabrain had been heavily defeated by the Picts, led by the powerful Brug of Inverness. And Gabrain's defeat was what brought Conall to the throne. Now, given this recent history, it was vital to Conall's interest to establish a good relationship with Columba. This was because Columba was also cousin to the kings of the northern Uí in Ireland. The northern Uí were very powerful, as shown by their victory at Codrevne, and they could become a powerful ally for the beleaguered Dalriata after their defeat by the Picts. And similarly, from Columba's perspective, it was essential to contact King Conall as soon as possible after leaving Ireland. As a man with an aristocratic background, Columba knew that the correct protocol to be followed was to make himself known to the king. In a sense, it was a bit like 19th century missionaries going to Africa. You didn't just wander into somebody's country, you had to make contact with the monarch and establish permission before you could do a work. And Columba, in a slightly different situation, but he follows the same protocol. And Columba knew there was no way he could wash up on an island of the Inner Hebrides and take control of it. Respect had to be given, contacts had to be made, permission had to be gained. Only then could he settle. So a missionary monk in need of a home met a king in desperate need of ally. And the bond between Columba and Conall was the first association that Columba made in Argyll, in Scottish Dalriata. Adomnan gives the clear impression that Columba went straight to Conall. So what else do we know about King Conall? He was in power from 560 to 574, but it was a circumscribed power. The Scots of Dalriata had been defeated in battle by the Picts. They were in a weakened position, although they were still an independent entity and not under direct Pictish control. Significantly, the Annals of Tigernach refer to Conall merely as Ri Dalriata, King of Dalriata. His predecessor Gabrain had been termed Ri Alban, King of Scotland. And the change of title points to a contraction of Conall's power compared with what had gone before, after the Dalriatans suffered a heavy defeat just before he became king. So Conall was a man with his back to the wall. On his northern and eastern frontiers were hostile Picts. To the south were the Britons of Strathclyde, holding sway from their fortress at Allclute, the Martin Rock. And Christian Dalriata was largely limited to what we know as Argyll today. The threatening, unconverted Picts still dominated and occupied the huge vastness of the Highlands. Now, where did Columba and Conall meet? Some tourist information here. This was probably at Dunad, at the top of the Kintyre Peninsula, just 5 miles northwest of Loch Gilphead. Dunad Farm is the end of half-mile single-track tarred road, signposted Dunad Fort, and you can holiday in 2 self-catering cottages at the very foot of the hill. 2 of them are named Congal and Gabran, after kinsmen of Fergus More, the legendary first Celtic king of Dalriata, after whose sons, according to legend, the 3 main areas of Dalriata are named also. Dunad was the secular seat of power, but not necessarily the king's permanent residence. As was the case with most monarchs of his time, Conall would make regular progresses through his dominion. That kept him up to date with what was happening in his kingdom. It enabled him to dispense justice, most of all ensured that he was seen. It was vital for a king to be seen, because only then could a king prove his health, his strength, his authority. You know, in North Korea, if we don't see a military leader for several months, we wonder, have they gone? And so Conall, like other kings, had to move round the kingdom and here, and still in power. Absence and invisibility brought rumour, presence maintained power. Now the date of Columba's arrival in Iona depends how much time he is reckoned to have spent elsewhere, so it's varied from 563 to 574 as an extreme, but a year close to 563 is the most likely option. But even before Columba's arrival on Iona, he spent time on the island of Hinba, and perhaps even on some other islands. Now, Hinba is one of the great unknowns in early Celtic Christian history. You can see where Iona is, just off Mull there. Yet Hinba is mentioned time after time by a Dominic. Its precise identity is still to be pinned down. If you read any travel document about the islands of the Western Isles, they will all say, I am Himba. They're sort of Spartacus-like. It's been used as a spiritual base for Irish monks long before Iona came into the equation. So where was Himba? Himba has been identified with almost every habitable island of the Southern Hebrides, Jura, Colonsay, Oronsay, Tiree, and nearly all of them have been suggested and argued for. There is a passage in Adomnan's Life of Columba that might be a clue to Himba's whereabouts. Because the fact that we don't know where it was doesn't stop us making theories. There's a section in Book 3 where Adomnan describes a meeting Columba had with 4 great men of faith who had come from Ireland to see him. And this was when Columba was based on Iona, but still visited Hinba on retreat from time to time. The 4 men were Congal, Kenneth, Brendan and Cormac. And they met with Columba on Hinba, and together they celebrated the sacred mysteries of the Eucharist together. As the 4 had come from Ireland, it is reasonable to assume that Hinba was between Iona and Ireland. Maybe not in a straight line between the two, but certainly south rather than north of Iona itself. It also seems reasonable to assume that Hinba would not be a large island such as Jura. Too large an island couldn't create the conditions sought for in a place of spiritual retreat. Radcliffe Barnett suggests the island of Elchiniv. Please forgive my gallant pronunciation. Just off the south coast of Mull, part of the Garvelix. And this is now the option favoured by many modern scholars. So if you were to read the likes of Ian Bradley and many others, then if they have to opt for where Hinba was, they will go for Elchiniv in the Garvelix. On the island, there are ancient, here we are, It's the southern of the three Gervelic Islands. And on that particular island there are beehive cells, which point to ancient and continuous usage of the island by Irish missionary monks. There's also a tradition, a very long-standing tradition, that Columba's mother was buried on that island. Now again, we need to stress that no one knows exactly Hinba's location. What we do know is that during Columba's first days in Scotland, what we call Scotland, Hinba was his home. So Columba spent time on Hinba before he moved to Iona, and it may be that on leaving Ireland he deliberately planned Hinba as his first destination. And this is because Illick is only 12 miles from Dún Ard, and therefore it was also an ideal base from which he could go and meet with King Conall. So Columba, if that's where Hinba is, and of course we don't know, if that's where it is, again the tradition is that the first place he came to was Southend, and the very southern tip of the Mull of Kintyre, and there you can go and you can see the very footstep in the rock that Columba made when he stepped ashore. And having made footfall in Scotland at Southend in the Mull of Kintyre, having sailed over, I think it's just about 12 miles from Ireland, something like that, and something that you can see from Ireland when you leave Ireland, that he would then make his way up to Hinba, and then from Hinba he would have the possibility of going just inland to where Dunad was and meet with King Conall before eventually being redirected to Iona. So today we managed to move Columba from Ireland to Scotland. And next week, God willing, we'll look at the community on Iona and the type of life that Columba and the monks lived out there. Any questions?
When did he get known as Columkille, and what was his name? Do we have a name for him before that?
Very early.
Oh, right.
Yeah, I mean, I think Domnall gives him that name. Crimnath is often quoted as his Crimthon is often quoted as being a sort of original name. But certainly he attracted the name Columkille very early. Very early. So for example, if you read the Amar Columkille, only written 1 year after his death, he died 597, the Amar was written 598, then Amar Columkille, elegy in praise of Columba.
So he would have been known as Columba when he came to Scotland?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
Something we'll also do next week is we'll have a more detailed look, as I said, at Domnall's life of Columba and problems about it and how to read it. And we'll also try and look at some of the very ancient texts and see what we can learn from them, as well as talking about the actual life, the monastic life on Iona.